out DNA testing from his car, home, and office. The results they believe could help them as a court fight brews over the genetic genealogy that led police to Kohberger for October. And in newly filed court documents, his lawyers say none of the victims' DNA was found in Kohberger's apartment, home, office, or car. The revelation came in court documents filed by Kohberger's lawyers, objecting to the prosecution's request for a protective order on the investigative genetic genealogy the FBI used to ID Kohberger as a suspect. Prosecutors claim Kohberger, dressed in all black, went into the house on King Road after 4 a.m. on November 13th of last year, and in less than 20 minutes killed all 4 students by stabbing. Then they say he got into his white Hyundai Elantra and took off, driving a longer route back to his apartment in Pullman, Washington. The arrest of Kohberger happened 6 weeks after the murder, so that's plenty of time to clean up. And a source had told me some time ago that Kohberger's car appeared to be bleached. But getting rid of blood can be incredibly difficult. Blood, of course, contains DNA. Kohberger's defense team also claims prosecutors are hiding crucial parts of the investigation from them that they want to see, including the genetic genealogy the FBI used to build family trees that led them to the Kohberger family. Investigators say Kohberger's DNA was left on the snap of the K-bar knife sheath left next to Maddie Mogen's body. When the test result came back to a single source of male DNA, and it didn't result in a hit in a national database of known felons called CODIS, the FBI turned to genetic genealogy to try to find a suspect. The feds built the family trees from there, and that led them to Kohberger's father, and later him. Prosecutors do not want to turn that information over to the defense and have asked the judge for a protective order. In fact, prosecutors cite another case when they claim they shouldn't have to turn over that information. But the defense is having none of it. Kohberger's attorneys say they should get to see the materials that led to their client being labeled a suspect. Kohberger's lawyers also say that 2 other DNA profiles from the King Road home were run through CODIS, along with a male DNA profile found on a glove outside of the home. Kohberger has, of course, pleaded not guilty to 1 count of burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder in the murders of all 4 students. His trial is set for October. Joining me to discuss the very latest and all of this new information about the case against Bryan Kohberger is James Bogan. He's a criminal defense attorney in Ohio. James, welcome to Sidebar. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Always nice to be here, Anjanette.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. Quickly, just off the top of this, there's so much new information that we've learned from these documents that were filed late Friday. The fact that Bryan Kohberger is facing 4 charges of first-degree murder and a burglary count for the homicides and for this awful thing that happened last November, and his defense team is saying the information they've been given shows no connection between Bryan Kohberger and the victims. As a defense attorney, your thoughts on their claim?
Well, they're going to have to back them up at trial. If they're claiming there's no connection, there have been cell tower pings which are not conclusive in themselves. Then, yeah, his touch DNA was found on the knife sheath. That can be addressed too by the fact that touch DNA can be transferred by more than just the perpetrator touching the item in question. For example, if I shake hands with you and then go kill somebody, your DNA will be on the murder weapon. But you also have alleged messages on Instagram in some of the months leading up to this incident from Bryan Kohberger to one of the victims. Now, obviously, that's stuff that if the prosecution's alleging the stuff, they're going to have to back that up. So, yeah, there's a pretty interesting mix of evidence and arguments here.
And I want to be clear about this whole thing about the Instagram messages. That was reported by one news outlet, and we haven't been able to verify that. We don't even know if that's true. That was one news outlet that reported that information, citing an anonymous source. There's been a lot of anonymous source information in this case, so we have to be really careful about that. But what I find interesting about it is that, yeah, what I find interesting about it is they're saying there's no connection. Then we move on to the DNA part of this. The DNA part is them saying that what I find interesting, they're saying there's no DNA of the victims, and this is a crime that would have been incredibly bloody. We have 4 college students stabbed to death in a home. One of them, we know, Xana Kernodle, according to her father, fought back. So there was some type of altercation there with a knife, and yet the defense team is saying in this filing that there wasn't any of the victims' DNA in this case found in Brian Koberger's home, his office, his apartment, or his vehicle that the state says he was driving that night of the homicide. So would you expect, after a crime that is so bloody, it had to have been, that there would be no evidence of their victim's DNA in this vehicle?
That's actually very shocking if you're on the prosecution side of this. Yeah, that certainly helps the defense. Now, if there happens to be some evidence that he did some complete deep cleaning, that's one thing that could possibly mitigate that for the prosecution. But on its face, yeah, it definitely doesn't help the prosecution if there's really is no DNA from the victims in either Mr. Kohlberger's car or at his home.
And we did, as I mentioned earlier, up at the top of this, we had been given information I had back in January that he may have bleached this car. That hasn't come up in any court filings yet, but that is something I was told from somebody I consider reliable. Another thing that I find interesting about all of this is the fact that the defense, they've received 51 terabytes of information from the prosecution. That includes video evidence, reports. They obviously have some DNA evidence, some DNA testing results back from the crime lab. They've been given that information, but they're saying the state is still trying to hide its case from them. And they're talking about the genetic genealogy that was used to identify a suspect in this case from that touch DNA that was found on the knife sheath laying next to Maddie Mogen's body. They cited a case, the Green case, where they said, oh, look at this other case. In that case, the prosecution wasn't required to turn over the genetic genealogy information to the defense, so we shouldn't have to do it either. What is your take on that? Because I find that confounding, that you would not have to, as the prosecution, you wouldn't be required to turn over evidence that led you to a suspect, and you're citing all this information, but you wouldn't turn it over to the defense so they could defend their client.
I think that's the fox guarding the hen house, expecting the judge to trust him. When the fox guarding the hen house says, trust me, you don't have to check on the hens, that definitely is what I'm thinking we have here by the state. Now, the defense cites a case of their own where they use the methodology from a facial recognition software, where another court found that had to be disclosed, and saying it shouldn't be disclosed to the defense to protect all those innocent people in the database and so on. That is completely going over the top. If they really feel the need to have those people protected, it can easily be done with a protective order where only counsel is allowed to view it.
I was wondering too, why wouldn't you just say only counsel can view this information, but we're going to turn it over? Why do you think that the prosecution is so loath to turn this over, James? Because I would think that this would be pretty discoverable. This would be kind of like Exhibit A of discovery that should be turned over. This is how you found our guy. This is how you determined or figured out or tried to find out that my client was the suspect. So why would they not want that information turned over? I understand they're saying, oh, we want to protect the identity of all these other relatives, but doesn't that seem like something that should be turned over?
It does. And again, that's where I use my fox guarding the henhouse analogy. They're basically saying, trust the fox who's guarding the henhouse to say he's not going after the hens without checking on the hens yourself. And even just real basic. Remember when we did math class when we were going up in school, it was always show your work. You don't just give an answer. And that's another analogy I'll use here. How did they get to that conclusion? The state definitely needs to turn that over so the defense can adequately investigate that. Given that this is a death penalty case, if the judge doesn't let the defense look at that stuff, he's asking for reversal on appeal.
There were two other interesting items included in the defense's kind of response to the state's motion for a protective order, in which they said there were two other male DNA profiles that the prosecution, the police, had run through CODIS, the DNA index system that tracks known felons. So it was two other male profiles found in the home, then a third male DNA profile found on a glove outside the home. What is that telling you? If they ran these through CODIS, would those profiles be profiles they just couldn't identify from other people that had been in the house? Or are these DNA profiles that are on items of evidence that could be noteworthy?
That depends. I mean, it depends on who these people are and how their locations can be verified. I mean, quite frankly, at any crime scene, unless it was completely scrubbed down right before the crime happened, you're always going to have multiple DNA sources, multiple DNA found at any scene, whether it's a car or a house. And apparently this may have been a party house too, with a lot of people going in and out. So really the fact that there's multiple DNA here, that's not really surprising to me, because that's really the reality of it. It's not like CSI where, they found one hair by the suspect and there's nothing else at the scene. No, it's always a mixed bag at every scene.
And this house was a party house. I mean, we've seen the body camera footage. I mean, this is a house where kids were in and out all of the time. Multiple kids, whether it was women, men, what have you, a lot of people in and out, plus that glove that was found outside the crime scene. We've heard a lot of talk about that over the many months, people speculating that could have been the killer leaving a glove behind, what have you. But this house, yeah, exactly. A lot of people have kind of likened it to that. But what I find interesting though is this house was a petri dish. It's literally a petri dish of DNA, and you find 3 profiles, one outside the house, 2 inside, that you decide to run through CODIS. So to me, I'm thinking those had to be profiles that they couldn't eliminate as belonging to other people who had been in the house, and that they were thinking might be leading them to a suspect. Am I wrong?
Well, again, it's a mixed bag. It could be anybody, and again, they can't just rely on a DNA hit. They're going to have to look at who are these people, where could they have been during the time of the murder. They can't just say DNA and not look at anything else. But yeah, that just goes to my point that any crime scene is going to be a mixed bag of DNA, and it doesn't really tell you when the DNA was left there. It just tells you it was left there in some way, shape, or form.
Another thing that the defense is arguing about, and we should mention Bryan Kohberger will be back in court on Tuesday afternoon out there in Moscow, Idaho.
Welcome back to my Mental Health and Crime channel. My name is Huda London. Please like, share, and subscribe. This is the case of the Idaho quadruple murders. May the 4 victims rest in peace. Condolence to the families. Merry Christmas to everybody, and a Happy New Year. This picture is of Eaton, his Jeep. When the detectives came to the scene after 11:58 a.m., I think they came 4 hours later, around 5. They went inside the house and they got the keys to a couple of vehicles. This red Jeep hasn't been returned to the Chapin family over 12 months. So what happened inside this Jeep? The detectives and prosecution have kept the red Jeep and the white vehicle as evidence. It's frozen in time, so I wonder why. Were the couple on the way from the Sigma Chi party? Were they attacked on the way home? The crime scene was already tampered with. Look at the officer blowing his nose. And then he went back inside the crime scene. Chief Fry is there, and the captain is there. The front row was left open. I wonder who left it open. Was it BF? Was it DM? Was it the suspects who did it? Was it Brian Christopher Kohlberger? It was a targeted quadruple murder. So who were the targets? Katie had the most fatal wounds. Not fatal wounds, sorry. She had the most injuries. But she was sleeping in Maddie's room. I believe it was somebody who used to party with the girls, who knew the house well, inside and outside. And something went wrong. Who would want 4 young people gone, unlived? There has to be a serious motive. It's hard for me to believe that somebody was just stalking them and had enough. That doesn't make sense. There was no blood evidence found in Brian Christopher Kohlberger's car or house. Strands of hair and all that was found in his house, if they were of any beneficial and if it belonged to one of the victims, don't you think the prosecution would have whistled that out by now? They would have had enough evidence to take Brian Christopher Kohlberger down without a fight. They don't have evidence because the other people involved, or maybe it's not even Brian who did this, because the timelines we were given at the beginning for the first 6.5 weeks till Brian Christopher Kohlberger was arrested, we were told it was between 3 to 4 a.m. And that doesn't go with the timeline to when Brian Christopher Kohlberger was first seen. Around there, it was 3:26 a.m. Now they want to demolish the house so quickly. Why? What's the hurry? You'll hide it up for the most of the time. Just keep it a bit longer so that the correct justice is served. Some of the families are in favor of not demolishing the house. So I don't understand what's the hurry. Trigger warning to what I'm going to say. as adults. But this has always come across my mind from the beginning of this story. On the 13th of November, I put up a post the very first time it happened. I remember most of us YouTubers and the YouTube world were still recovering from the Kylie Rodney case. And then this case came up. And I remember thinking to myself, 4 young students are unlived. And there isn't any essay. Thank God. So I was thinking to myself, this has to be not a boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. It has to be more than that. It had to be more like revenge, hate, jealousy. Because there were 3 young, beautiful girls, young women. So I believe this is somebody who's been inside the house, who they know, or who must have been there a couple of times and partied. And I understand